When talking about the Cold War in Asia, Stephen Kotkin opened with a line that stopped me instantly. He said, "Asia is half the world, but all of time." Then he followed it with something even more jarring. Asia must be a central part of our story. And I realized I had to unpack it, and in the next few minutes, I'll explain exactly why he said it, and why it changes everything we think we know about the Cold War. Because if you grew up with the standard Cold War narrative, you probably picture Berlin first. The wall, NATO, the Iron Curtain. Europe is the center of gravity in almost every documentary, every textbook, every political speech about that era. But when you sit with Kotkin's argument, the map starts to shift. The key turning points, the decisions that shape the global order for the next 70 years, didn't happen in Europe. They happened in Asia, often in places Western policymakers barely understood. And sometimes, over maps, they literally grabbed off a shelf at the last minute. Kotkin gives you a structure for understanding all of it. He says, "I'm going to speak about what I call 4 partitions in East Asia."
So in fact, the Cold War could be seen not as a tragic story, but as a triumphal story, or at least as something combining both the tragedy and the triumph. I'm going to try that today. My first point is I'm going to speak about what I call 4 partitions in East Asia. 4 partitions in East Asia.
And suddenly the whole region comes into focus. Korea at the 38th parallel. Japan divided at its northern island chain. Vietnam fractured first at the 16th parallel. Then at the 20th, China split between Taiwan and the British returned to Hong Kong. These aren't just borders. They're fault lines, cracks left behind by a war that ended too suddenly for anyone to manage properly. What makes Kotkin's framing so powerful is that he doesn't treat these partitions as separate incidents. He ties them together into a single story, a chain reaction of rushed decisions, mismatched expectations, power vacuums, and improvisation. And that's the part most people forget. When World War II ended, the world didn't slide smoothly into peace. It fell into a void. Kotkin puts it plainly, pun not. When the fighting stops, there's a big vacuum and everyone is rushing to fill the vacuum. And that vacuum, that sudden collapse of structure, authority, and clarity, became the birthplace of the Cold War. You can't plan for something like that. You can write memoranda, you can hold conferences, you can make assumptions about how your allies will behave or how your rivals will negotiate. But when millions of soldiers lay down their weapons on the same day, everything stops at once, and the world becomes unpredictable in a way no one can control. Everyone improvised. The Americans improvised, scrambling to figure out who would occupy which territory and how fast they could get there. The British improvised, struggling to reassert authority with the empire fraying in every direction. China was collapsing internally. Japan was shattered. But the Soviet Union, and this is where Kotkin is brutally clear, improvised in one direction only, toward coercion, toward central control, toward extending unfreedom wherever possible. And once you understand that, the rest of the story starts lining up with eerie clarity. Because Asia, in Kotkin's telling, isn't just a region where the Cold War happened. It's the region that reveals what the Cold War actually was. Not a misunderstanding, not a diplomatic failure, but a struggle born from incompatible values colliding inside a vacuum left behind by the end of the biggest war in human history. And the cracks that formed in those first chaotic months, the partitions he identifies, didn't just shape Asia. They shaped the entire global order we're still living in. When you keep following Kotkin's logic, the story only gets stranger. Because while the world was stumbling through the sudden emptiness of 1945, the major powers were clinging to an illusion, the belief that the wartime alliance would somehow continue into peacetime. Kotkin calls this out with almost brutal simplicity. He says, the wartime allies thought they would keep the alliance. This was a crazy delusional idea.
There was a lot of confusion because the wartime allies thought that they would keep the alliance. This was a crazy, delusional idea.
And once you hear it stated that plainly, you start to see the cracks everywhere. The alliance had been held together by one thing: the need to defeat Germany and Japan. Once that purpose evaporated, so did the unity. The United States wanted demobilization and a return to normal life. Britain wanted to hold on to a fading empire. China was imploding, and the Soviet Union, the country that had paid the highest price in blood, was determined to shape the new order on its own terms. Yet somehow, despite all of this, Western leaders kept imagining that cooperation will continue. They were celebrating victory while ignoring the tectonic shift beneath their feet. And here's the paradox Kotkin highlights: while Europe absorbed most of the attention, especially over Poland, the real hinge of global history was China. The decisions Washington, Moscow, and Beijing made in those years mattered far more to the long-term balance of power than anything that happened in Eastern Europe. But the world treated China as secondary, almost like background noise to the European story. Kotkin puts it sharply when he notes that Poland mattered existentially to Poles, yes, but to the future world order, China mattered infinitely more. As the great powers tried to navigate this new landscape, another misunderstanding took shape, not just about alliances, but about the nature of conflict itself. People began treating the Cold War as a mistake, as if it were avoidable, as if someone somewhere could have made one better decision and spared the world decades of tension. Kotkin rejects that completely. He argues that the Cold War wasn't a failure. It was the only outcome that didn't lead to catastrophe. In his words, the Cold War was an achievement.
Let me drive the point home a little bit deeper about point number 4, the Cold War is an achievement. When two great powers clash, there are only 4 options. Great power competition, history knows only 4 options.
And when you sit with that idea, it's jarring. We're so used to framing the Cold War as something tragic, something wasteful, something born of paranoia. But Kotkin reframes it as a success because he's comparing it to the alternatives. He sketches out the options with a kind of historical bluntness. There's hot war. And we know what that looks like. Tens of millions dead. Cities erased. Entire regions destabilized. There's appeasement, a word that comes with a very specific shadow after the 1930s, a strategy that only delays the inevitable while making the outcome worse. Then there's what he calls Pygmalionism, the idea that you can transform another great power's political culture from the outside, that you can turn them into something that fits your worldview. Kotkin points out that the United States tried this after the war. They tried it with Japan. They tried it with Germany. And then, decades later, they tried it again with Russia and China, believing they could integrate them into a rules-based order simply by exposing them to it. It didn't work, because those regimes didn't want to be absorbed into the system. They wanted to change the system itself. That leaves one option standing: Cold War. Not because it was peaceful, not because it was comfortable, but because it was the only great power framework that didn't lead directly to catastrophe. And that's where Kotkin drives the point home. It's a misunderstanding, but it is a fundamental clash of interests and values.
Some people blame both, as if it's a misunderstanding. But it is a fundamental clash of interests and values. It's not a misunderstanding. They could talk more and it wouldn't help, because the interests, and even deeper than the interests, the values, are fundamentally opposed.
Once you accept that, the map of Asia begins to look different. The partitions weren't accidents. They were pressure valves, lines drawn to contain competing visions of how society should be organized. The Cold War wasn't simply happening in Asia. Asia was where it made sense. Once Kotkin makes the case that the Cold War was the only option that didn't end in catastrophe, he shifts to the places where that collision of values actually touched the ground. And the first place, where the theory becomes painfully real, is Korea. This is the moment when his argument stops being abstract and becomes a story of timing, improvisation, and decisions made faster than anyone could interpret them. In Kotkin's telling, Korea in 1945 wasn't the inevitability we assume today. It was a shock. The Red Army raced down the peninsula immediately after Japan surrendered, moving fast, moving decisively, while the United States had no troops anywhere close. Stalin could have invaded and taken the whole Korean peninsula. But he doesn't. Why? That question hangs in the air because it cuts directly against our assumptions about power. We tend to imagine leaders like Stalin acting with total clarity, but the truth is far messier. Stalin wasn't thinking only about Korea. He was thinking about Japan, about Germany, about the Kuril Islands, about negotiations with Truman happening almost in real time, each message stitched together with domestic crises, foreign calculations, and the constant fear of misreading the moment. Kotkin's point is that even the most powerful people are overwhelmed. They operate under pressure, under exhaustion, with conflicting priorities and limited time. So the 38th parallel didn't emerge because it made strategic sense. It emerged because both sides needed a line, any line that prevented escalation at a moment when escalation was unthinkable. The partition was not destiny. It was improvisation carved into a map. Then the story moves to Vietnam, and Vietnam is where the contradictions become almost surreal. Japan surrenders earlier than expected. American planners, caught off guard, rush to draft General Order No. 1, telling Japanese forces who to surrender to. Northern Indochina goes to the Chinese nationalists. Southern Indochina goes to the British Southeast Asia Command. And this is where the story fractures. The British don't have available forces, so they use Indian troops. Men fighting for independence at home, now tasked with reimposing colonial rule abroad. The Japanese soldiers, who had dismantled French authority, now become the soldiers helping restore it. Meanwhile, in the north, the Chinese warlords block the French from returning because they want the territory for themselves, and in doing so, they unintentionally hand space and momentum to Ho Chi Minh. No mastermind designed this. It is improvisation layered on improvisation, a cascade of decisions made too quickly, without enough information, each one creating consequences no one intended. And through all of this, the Soviet Union, the country we often imagine pulling the strings, is almost absent. Kotkin emphasizes how Stalin refused to meet Ho Chi Minh, rejected envoys, and largely ignored the Vietnamese Revolution. The map of Vietnam did not emerge from a Soviet plan. It emerged from the vacuum Kotkin keeps talking about, the vacuum that appears the moment a global war ends and no one knows how to fill the space that follows. China, though, is where the entire story converges. It is the largest piece on the board, the one that mattered most for the future of world order, and Kotkin makes it clear that China wasn't destined to become the People's Republic in its entirety. It could have been divided like Korea. It could have ended up with two competing governments inside one civilizational sphere, but Chiang Kai-shek, refusing any compromise or negotiated partition, gambled everything and lost everything except Taiwan. If Asia is where history turned, then China is the hinge. When Kotkin reaches the end of this story, he isn't just summarizing events, he's stripping away the illusion that any of this was orderly. The post-war world wasn't designed. It lurched forward. It contradicted itself. It produced outcomes that no one intended and few understood at the time. And nowhere is that clearer than in the final pieces of the puzzle: Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the way revolutionary nationalism collided with communism across Asia. Kotkin loves paradoxes because history is built from them, and his Hong Kong example is maybe the most striking. According to General Order No. 1, Hong Kong should have been taken by Chinese nationalist forces. They were physically closer, their troops were available, and on paper, they were the designated authority. But the British moved anyway. They sailed back, asserted control, and re-established colonial administration years before anyone predicted they could. That act, an empire desperate to reclaim a symbol at the edge of collapse, ended up shaping China's economic future far more than anyone involved could imagine. Without Hong Kong functioning as a rule of law financial hub, without capital flowing through it into the special economic zones, without its strange, accidental autonomy, China's economic miracle in the late 20th century looks completely different. And then there is Taiwan, the last foothold of the nationalist government, the remnant created not by a master plan but by refusal. Chiang Kai-shek refused partition, refused negotiation, refused to accept that a two-state outcome might be the only way to preserve part of what he wanted to save. And in that refusal, he lost mainland China but preserved something else entirely, a democratic path that would emerge decades later, a countermodel living in the shadow of the People's Republic. Nothing about it was inevitable. Everything about it was improvised. This is the moment where Kotkin pulls the camera back again. He returns to that idea he hinted at from the beginning, that the real challenge in 1945 wasn't just communism. It was revolutionary nationalism. The combination of the two was the explosive force no one managed well. Some countries, like India, found a democratic version of nationalism strong enough to contain the revolutionary strain. Others didn't. And in those failures, Vietnam, Korea, China, Afghanistan, you see the darker side of the Cold War, the side that wasn't avoided. The proxy wars, the decades of insurgency and counterinsurgency. The places where great power conflict didn't explode into direct confrontation, but instead burned slowly, relentlessly, through smaller nations caught in the middle. For Kotkin, that's the unresolved contradiction at the heart of this era. The Cold War prevented a world-ending conflict, but it didn't prevent suffering. It didn't prevent miscalculation. It didn't prevent the tragedies that come from misunderstanding revolutionary nationalism or underestimating what people will do in the name of identity. And he returns to this idea with a final clarity, a reminder that cuts across every comforting narrative we build about this period. History is nothing but perverse and unintended consequences. That line stays with you because it reframes everything he's been saying. The Cold War wasn't shaped by genius, it was shaped by accidents. It wasn't won by perfect planning, it was won because the one survivable option, Cold War, held long enough for the world to adapt around it. And this is where Kotkin's warning becomes unmistakable. The partitions he describes didn't disappear. They hardened. They froze into the political structures we live with today. Taiwan, Korea, the South China Sea, Hong Kong. The same cracks that formed in 1945 are the ones we still debate, still fear, still try to navigate. If anything, they matter more now. So when he says Asia is all of time, he isn't being poetic, he's being literal. The decisions made in a handful of hurried months after World War II created the architecture of the world we inhabit. And if another moment of global vacuum comes, another sudden collapse of order, the question isn't whether history will repeat itself. It's whether we've learned enough from these unintended consequences to avoid improvising our way into the next crisis.